Throughout the mid-80s and 90s, 2D platformers were the pinnacle of the home video game console market, with franchises like Super Mario, Sonic the Hedgehog, and Donkey Kong Country consistently topping the global sales charts. By the mid-90s, the 3D revolution was in full swing, as developers raced to be the first to bring their new 3D titles to market. While racing games, fighting games, and shooters had already proven their 3D viability in the arcades, character action platformers had yet to successfully make the transition. It only made sense then for developers to try their hands at bringing this hugely popular genre into the third dimension, though it wasn't clear how exactly they were supposed to do that. That is, until the launch of the critically acclaimed Super Mario 64 in 1996, that went on to set the template for what 3D platformers would be going forward. However, that same year, another 3D character action platformer broke onto the scene to challenge Mario's dominance in the market, and positioned Sony's PlayStation as the de facto video game console of the 5th generation, Crash Bandicoot. In this video, we'll be taking a look back at Crash's history, how the first game came about, the evolution of its 2 sequels, and why developer Naughty Dog sharply pivoted towards making a kart racer before saying goodbye to Crash forever. This is the history of Crash Bandicoot. Crash Bandicoot started life in 1994, when Naughty Dog co-founders Andy Gavin and Jason Rubin were finishing up work on their self-financed Mortal Kombat-inspired 3D fighting game, Way of the Warrior. By this point in time, the duo already had a number of titles under their belts, having spent the preceding decade developing a variety of games for the Apple II and Sega Mega Drive. In January 1994, at the Winter Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, they signed Way of the Warrior to the then newly formed Universal Interactive Studios, headed by Skip Poole and Robert Binias. While Crystal Dynamics and 3DO itself both offered to publish the title, Universal ultimately won them over when they offered them a 3-game Hollywood housekeeping deal. They'd provide Naughty Dog with office space and all the necessary amenities for free in exchange for a first look at whatever Naughty Dog was making. They'd still have to pay their employees themselves, but at the time they didn't have any, so it seemed like a no-brainer. Part of the deal also included a special permission for Rubin's dog, Morgan, to be brought onto the back lot with them, as normally dogs weren't allowed on the lot. In June 1994, at Summer CES in Chicago, Skip Poole introduced the duo to their recently hired Vice President of Product Development, Mark Cerny, who had previously worked on games like Marble Madness and Sonic the Hedgehog 2. Cerny would prove to be an invaluable resource to Naughty Dog in the creation of their next game, which they'd been debating for months, but the 3-day drive from Boston, Massachusetts to Los Angeles, California would provide them with ample opportunity. So in August 1994, after work had concluded on Way of the Warrior, Gavin and Rubin packed up their belongings and Morgan into Gavin's Honda Accord and began the roughly 40-hour commute from Boston to LA to set up shop on Universal's backlot, where they were sandwiched between the Suzanne Summers Show and Steven Spielberg's film production company, Amberlin Entertainment. During their 3-day drive, the duo considered a bunch of ideas, including doing a 3D Final Fight-like side-scrolling beat-em-up featuring time-traveling scientists that had genetically merged with dinosaurs. However, their attention soon turned to the character action genre instead. They'd noticed that a handful of the leading game genres had begun making the transition into full 3D rendering, namely the racing genre, with games like Ridge Racer and Virtua Racing, the fighting game genre with Virtua Fighter, and the shooter genre with Virtua Cop. All of these games would debut in the arcade, but they knew that they wanted to make a console game, so they turned to the biggest genre on consoles at that time, character action platformers. Top examples were Super Mario World, the Sonic the Hedgehog series, and the phenomenal-looking Donkey Kong Country, which hadn't released yet, but they'd played it at trade shows and were completely blown away by it. On the second day of their drive, the idea came to them. They called it the Sonic's Ass game, and it was born from the question, what would a 3D character action platformer look like? Well, they realised, you'd spend a lot of time looking at Sonic's ass. Before leaving Boston, they'd hired their first employee, Dave Baggett, a brilliant programmer and friend of Gavin's from MIT, though he wouldn't start full-time until January 1995. Together, with Mark Cerny, the four became the main creative contributors to the game that would become Crash Bandicoot. After discussing the game's design, an agreement was made to go into production. Shortly thereafter, in September 1994, Universal recruited David Siller from Sunsoft to serve as the game's producer. Siller helped to keep Naughty Dog aware of what had been done before and what had succeeded in the past. while Cerny had a great knack for being able to stand back and take in the big picture. Cerny's technical expertise would also prove essential later on during development. One of the first big conversations the duo had with Cerny was in regards to staffing. Gavin and Rubin were used to making games between the two of them, and they thought maybe they'd staff up to 5 people, but they'd create 2 titles. Cerny, however, saw differently. As Universal Interactive's vice president, he'd been given a large amount of money with very little oversight on how to spend it, because Universal didn't know the business too well. So he suggested they really staff up and focus on one game. Naughty Dog took Cerny's advice and expanded its team by hiring visual effects artist Taylor Kurosaki, who was working on Universal's backlot and primarily doing work for an NBC TV show called seaQuest DSV, and a talented artist called Bob Raffi, who Sega was keen to hire, but Naughty Dog ultimately won him over thanks to their camaraderie and garage band feeling. Like Baggett, Kurosaki and Raffi wouldn't officially start until January 1995. Naughty Dog would later go on to hire 3 additional employees: sound engineer Dan Colmorgan, texture artist Charlotte Francis, and IT administrator Justin Manet. Together, alongside Gavin, Rubin and Baggett, these 8 individuals would become the core Naughty Dog team, with Cerny being seen as the nth dog. Their next step was figuring out which platform they should target. After weighing their options, they narrowed it down to the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation, but it soon became clear which one they should go with. The Saturn, while technically impressive for its time, was difficult for developers to wrap their heads around, which meant harnessing that power proved next to impossible. The PlayStation, by comparison, was much easier to develop for, and its GPU could draw an impressive number of polygons per second. So they bit the bullet, signed Sony's harsh developer agreement, and shelled out a sizable sum to procure their first dev unit. Now they just needed a character to pin their hopes on. They wanted to do what Sega had done with the Hedgehog and Warner Bros. Had done with the Tasmanian Devil, and base their character on a cute animal that no one really knew about. They bought a copy of Tasmanian Mammals, a field guide, flipped through its pages, and eventually stumbled upon the Wombat, which fit the bill, with them settling on the name Willy the Wombat, as Gavin and Rubin both liked alliteration. For the next month or 2, they were busy trying to figure out who this character was. They wanted a character that was not only video game friendly, but also friendly beyond video games. That is to say, if you create a character whose sole trait is that he's fast, for example, he doesn't have much of a personality beyond that. With that in mind, they undertook their then highly unusual approach of injecting real Hollywood production design into the game-making process. Spurred on by Cerny, they contracted a pair of talented cartoon artists, Joe Pearson and Charles Zimbillis. Pearson had been recommended to them by Will Muniot, a producer working in Universal Studios' animation department. After their first meeting, it was clear to Pearson that Naughty Dog was going to need a lot of work in a fairly short amount of time, so he contacted an old friend and mentor, Charles Zimbillis, to see if he'd work with him on the project. They negotiated their contract in December 1994 and were signed on by January 1995, with much of the initial development work being completed by March. When Pearson started work on the project, Naughty Dog already had a couple of ideas fleshed out, such as setting the game on an island, the game's villain, and some early stuff like that, but they didn't have any kind of backstory. So Pearson wrote a very detailed backstory for Crash and Cortex, and set it on 3 islands, which were based on the legend of the lost continent of Lemuria. Lemuria was like Atlantis, an ancient civilization that sunk into the ocean and was destroyed. By basing it on Lemuria, it led to Pearson creating the Aztec and Tiki-inspired ruins that are scattered about the Crash Islands. The design for the exterior of Cortex Castle shared the same motif, with some Cambodian-style stupas mixed in. As for Crash himself, Naughty Dog drew from a large pop culture pool, including every major video game made, 80s movies like The Goonies, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and Back to the Future, along with classic cartoons. After some initial concept art, it was Pearson's sketch of a Weasley-looking character with a big nose and a Zorro mask that ultimately decided the direction of the character. Zimbillis had originally been doing more of a hunkered-down character, inspired by Looney Tunes' Taz, because that's what Naughty Dog initially asked for, but once it became clear what direction they wanted Crash to go in, he adopted Pearson's design and further fleshed it out. Zimbillis was a very fast sketch artist, with a real knack for capturing cartoon emotion, so Naughty Dog could ask him to show them what Crash would look like, crying or laughing, etc., and he'd be able to draw it in under 2 minutes. He knew how to turn any little emotional nuance into the classic exaggerated cutesy cartoon style, and it was exactly what Naughty Dog wanted. However, it wasn't enough for Crash to only work on paper. He needed to work in-game as well. A number of design decisions were made purely based on their technical requirements. For instance, Crash's orange colour was selected after going through a list of popular characters and their colours, along with a list of earthly background possibilities, such as forests, beaches, etc., and then strictly ruling out colours that didn't look good on screen. Orange was chosen because it was available and stood out on NTSC televisions. They made sure not to include any lava levels in the game as a result of this design choice. Crash's large face was due to the low screen resolution. The necessity of having features large enough to be discernible pushed them towards the necklace look. This created a unique challenge for Xembilis, who had to figure out how Crash was going to be animated. The mouth and the body were the same shape, so he needed to figure out how to give him different expressions besides the constant smile. Turning his head was also a problem. There was no point to articulate the head from the body, so when he looked from side to side or turned to look back, it had to come from the waist. Crash's pupils had to be made from 2 polygons, because the texture might have disappeared if his pupils got too small. By making them out of polygons, they almost always showed up as long as the total eye, including whites, was more than a few pixels tall. Crash's black fingerless gloves came about because his fur had a fairly uniform colour, so the moment his hands moved past his body, they'd blend together. The black gloves gave your eyes something to track as they crossed Crash's body, and your mind could then fill in the rest. They were wrestling with these sorts of design constraints throughout the entire development process. The design of the game's villain, Cortex, came together much quicker than Crash. He was conceived when Gavin, Rubin, Baggett and Cerny were eating at a mediocre Italian restaurant near Universal. Rubin had become very fond of Pinky and the Brain, and they imagined a more malevolent Brain, with his minions being similar to the Weasels in Who Framed Roger Rabbit. A villain who's full of himself, unable to conceive of ever doing anything the simple way, and constantly betrayed, in his eyes, by the incompetence of his henchmen. Cortex was the character they had the most fun with early on, because in a lot of ways he had to drive the game. They also wanted to make a character that looked and felt like he understood that he was in a video game. It's cliched, and that's something that really bugs him. In fact, early plans had him turning to the camera and doing asides, but they later decided not to do these cutscenes since it broke the action. N-Cortex was a play on Neocortex, a section of the brain. He was named quickly and designed around it, and not vice versa. Like with Crash, Pearson did the initial character sketch for Cortex, and then Xembilis took over and further refined it. The brief Pearson got from Naughty Dog was to design a classic evil scientist, or Brainiac, so he did 10 initial designs. While 3 or 4 probably would have sufficed, he was having so much fun designing the character that he just kept coming up with new ideas. The consensus at Naughty Dog was they wanted to see the combination of 2 of the designs, a fusion of the first and the 10th, keeping the lower face and beard of the first, but putting it on the head and eyes of the 10th, with the general costume and body of the 10th. The combined elements are what led to Cortex's final design. Once the concept phase was finished, the next step was figuring out how to get these characters into the computer. Conventional PCs were not going to cut it, so they took the plunge and bought everyone an Indigo 2 Extreme Silicon Graphics workstation. These machines could cost upwards of $100,000, depending on the configuration, and the software to do the 3D graphics was equally expensive. They first tried using a 3D graphics application called Softimage Creative Environment, later renamed to Softimage 3D, but a number of factors caused them to switch to Alias Power Animator. Rubin then started creating a jungle using Pearson's background sketches as a template, but it soon became apparent that you couldn't just build levels with this kind of environmental density in Power Animator. They needed to spend several months creating a system and tools pipeline by which smaller chunks of the level could be hierarchically assembled into a larger whole. Baggett ended up creating what came to be known as Dave's Level Editor, or DLE for short. With it, an artist could make the individual slices or chunks of a level, and then use Photoshop to create a top-down map, which would then be fed into a giant script that told the computer how to combine all of the elements, assemble them, and save it out. An assortment of puzzle pieces and colour values were used to represent each slice, with typically 1 pixel representing a 1 meter in-game space. They couldn't have multiple elements occupying the same space, because they couldn't have 2 pixels on top of each other. If they wanted to render out an entire level, they'd have to wait 8 to 12 hours for it to finish. They'd build their levels overnight on their 7-machine render farm, usually between 4 AM and 10 AM, as those were the only times the office was empty, and come in to see the results. Because they were networked, when each machine finished its part of the level, they all said "level completed," so they'd hear it multiple times as each computer finished. Then they'd rush over to see if it actually worked. If there was an error, they'd have to go back and tweak their Photoshop files, rerun the tool, and wait another 8 to 12 hours to see the result. Gavin also wrote a new programming language for coding all of the gameplay, called Game-Oriented Object Lisp, or GOOL for short. It was designed specifically to address the limitations that object control code had in traditional languages. By using GOOL, they could prototype a new creature or object in as little as 10 minutes. New things could be tried and quickly elaborated on or discarded, and if the object didn't work out, it could be pulled from the game in seconds without leaving any hard-to-find and wasteful traces behind in the source code. After receiving their PlayStation Dev unit, they first needed to figure out how it worked. Reading the instructions, which had been poorly translated from Japanese, they were curious to see if Sony's claims were accurate. So they wrote some basic test code to put the machine through its paces. They discovered that the PS1 had this oddball 512x240 video mode that nobody else was using because it ate up video memory that other developers wanted for textures. Most PS1 games used the standard 320x240 resolution for this very reason. In any case, this 512 mode looked sharp, and they found that while Sony's claims about how many polygons the PlayStation could draw was accurate, polygons that were shaded but non-textured could be drawn twice as fast. In fact, it was just as fast in the 512 mode as it was in the standard 320 mode. By this point, Ruben had already made the model for Crash, so Gavin shrank it down to about the size it would appear in-game, and then ran some code to calculate the number of pixels that each of the polygons occupied on the screen, which turned out to be 1.2 pixels on average. They realised that at that size, what good would textures do? So they went with having more polygons on the characters and less texture, which most people didn't do. They used textured polygons almost exclusively for their backgrounds, and the shaded polygons for their characters, which worked well with their cartoony style. Crash himself ended up being 532 polygons, with textures only for his spots and shoelaces, which took up a significant portion of their total polygon budget. Given that he occupied a decent portion of the screen, and that they were trying to make him look like a real cartoon character, it only made sense for him to be made up of that many polygons. Then there was the issue of animation. They wanted their characters to squash and stretch in the style of traditional cell animation, as seen in classic Looney Tunes, Tex Avery, and Disney cartoons. Traditionally, in 90s era low-poly 3D computer graphics, characters were created by constructing a very small number of bones, such as an upper arm bone, lower arm bone, head bone, etc., and then sticking all of the art pertaining to that character's limb on said bone. It could then be moved or rotated, but nothing within it could change. This meant that if a character's arm was animating, for example, it would have a kind of stiff robotic movement to it. You also couldn't have a lot of bones, because it was simply too much maths for the PlayStation to handle. There was also the issue of joints. When you tried to move them, there'd be gaps between the bones as they moved, and it just didn't look very realistic or cartoony. With bones, it was also very difficult to do facial animation, and they knew that was something else they wanted. After all, what kind of cartoon character doesn't emote? The first step in tackling this was to see if it was even possible to get that kind of squash and stretch animation working on a Silicon Graphics workstation using Power Animator. So Ruben took his Crash model and set about trying to do cool and wacky animations with it, and he discovered that, with some work, you could get Power Animator to actually do it by employing a method known as vertex animation. When the bones failed them, and they often did, they just grabbed the vertices and yanked them around until things were fixed. In some of the most stretched or bent poses, they would just pull vertices by hand and forgot the bones altogether. They could go from Crash having a huge smile with a full set of teeth to a whistle mouth that was toothless, or no mouth at all, just by collapsing vertices on top of each other to create zero volume polygons. They could also use this method to warp the characters beyond their bones. For example, if they wanted Crash to become a balloon, Rubin could just animate a keyframe of him wrapped around a sphere, and it would then tween to it. The only problem was that the PS1 had no hope of matching this at runtime. But they knew where the positions of all the vertices were, in every frame, so if they just read the positions of all the vertices, then the end result would be the same. This strategy had a major flaw, however, and that was that in order to store the location of every vertex, every frame, at 30 frames a second, they'd need an enormous amount of data, far more than what the PS1's memory could store. So for months, Gavin, Baggett and Cerny racked their brains trying to figure out how they were going to fit this enormous amount of data into memory. But Gavin had a hunch that there wasn't really that much data, in a mathematical sense, and that they could write a domain-specific compressor to reduce its size. Think of it like a JPEG image. By removing some of the data, you end up sacrificing some quality, but you also dramatically reduce the file size. They realized that not all of the animation data was relevant. For instance, if you had a vertex on Crash's waist, it might move left to right, but not up and down, and yet they were still storing the location of every vertex on the X, Y, and Z axes. So Cerny wrote a program that would analyze every component of every vertex and calculate the amount of change that occurred across animations, and found that for most axes, the information change was quite low. By using this specialized tool to analyze a particular animation, they could compress it by something like 50 to 1. Doing this was no trivial task, however, as it required them to write advanced vertex compressors in assembly code. Gavin attempted it 3 times, Baggett twice, before finally Cerny took a crack at it, and his ended up being the best. Even still, there was a fundamental problem with the math side of the PlayStation that needed to be solved, but they kind of knew that it wasn't a hardware issue, rather a software one. Sony had written these graphic libraries in C that developers were expected to use in order to carry out specific functions, but these libraries weren't really utilizing the machine to its fullest. It just didn't run fast enough, and this was a serious problem. So they did what any good scientist does, and took the machine apart. They wanted to see what the designers had actually put inside the box to do the maths, and it turned out that there was this little maths coprocessor inside Sony's custom CPU, which could actually do what they needed for the vertex transformation, and it could do it at just about the speed that the GPU could consume it. So they wrote their own assembly code that essentially did the same thing as what Sony's official libraries were doing, just without having to be called from C, which is slower and less efficient. They did all kinds of weird hacks like this that, to be clear, they definitely weren't supposed to, like when they'd run out of memory, Gavin would take to stealing little bits and pieces by erasing parts of Sony's libraries that he thought he wasn't using. If things still worked, he'd mark them as available, and then he'd stick his own stuff on top of their parts of the memory that the operating system had loaded in, which, again, was against Sony's policy, but memory was so short on Crash Bandicoot that it was all they could do to fit everything in. The PS1 only had 2 MB of RAM and 1 MB of VRAM, which wasn't a lot to work with. But Gavin had a theory, going back to Way of the Warrior, that it would be possible to make levels much larger by taking advantage of the CD-ROM's 650 MB of read-only storage, and using advanced virtual memory techniques to swap 64K pages in and out from the disk. Within these pages were chunks of data that could be anything from geometry, animation, code, sound, etc., and they could fit around 16 pages into memory. The challenge was arranging the chunks in such a way that, at any one point in the level, they never needed more than 16 pages worth of data. While it's figured out in advance, the game would constantly work out which pages it was going to load in, depending on the direction you were travelling in. It would throw away old pages it didn't need, and load new ones in their place. All of this had to be done without any hitches, loading lags where the frame rate would drop below 30 Hz, and Gavin even controlled the physical layout of bytes on the CD-ROM, so that even at 300 kilobytes a second, the PS1 could load the data for each piece of a given level by the time Crash ended up there. Baggett wrote a tool that took the resources like art, sound, etc., and packed them into the 64K pages for Gavin's system. Some levels barely fit, so Baggett had to try a variety of algorithms and use whichever had the best result for any given level. Sometimes they'd get lucky, and the packer would manage to fit everything into the maximum allowed number of pages, but this meant that if they made a change to a level, it would blow out the page count, and they'd have to change other stuff semi-randomly until the packer once again found a packing solution that worked. Ultimately, they managed to fit Crash into the PS1's 2 MB memory with only 4 bytes to spare out of the total 2,097,152 bytes. But it wasn't enough for their characters and animations to look good. They also wanted lush, detailed worlds that captured the same look and feel as Pearson's gorgeous environmental sketches. In order to pull this off, they needed to create a pre-occlusion system that was sort of inspired by Doom. In Doom, John Carmack implemented a binary space partition tree that told him from within which room what could be seen. For example, if you're in a room and the doors are closed, the room beyond that doesn't actually need to be rendered, but most naive rendering systems did so anyway, and then it would just be hidden away by the doors. This was extremely wasteful, as you might end up spending a third of your rendering time drawing what's behind the doors, but actually figuring out what needed to be drawn and what didn't was complicated. Naughty Dog knew that if they could figure this out, it would allow their renderer to handle many more polygons, and more polygons meant they could have richer, more detailed backgrounds. After doing some experiments with a free-roaming camera, they settled on a branching rail camera, kind of like how a dolly is used in film production. The idea was that the camera would follow along next to, behind, or in front of the character, moving on a kind of track through the world. So they used their SGI workstations to take every place the camera could be and compute exactly what could be seen from that point of view, so that the engine only drew what was visible. Whenever they had too many polygons on screen, the art team would have to add occluders, like trees, cliffs, walls, and twists and turns in the environment, to hide the landscape from view. They were constantly butting up against the polygon draw limit, as they wanted to have as much distance and detail visible as possible. Rubin made Gavin play a buzzer sound every time they went over in-game poly limits, which became the bane of the art team's existence. They'd get to a point where a level was perfectly balanced, and then someone, usually Rubin or Cerny, would determine that a level was too hard or too easy, and they'd have to add in an extra platform or enemy. Then the level builder, usually Raffi or Kurizaki, would then have to start balancing the polygon background count all over again. As a result, no level was truly done until the game shipped. Another difficult challenge they faced was with the game's collision detection. From the very beginning, they knew this would be difficult, and indeed it was. Crash would often be within a meter or two of several hundreds of polygons, which meant the game had to store and process a great deal of data in order to calculate the collision reactions. Their environments were more detailed than most games had attempted at that point, and there was no known solution for such complex collision detection in games. Developers would often just let their characters wade through most objects, and stuck to simple flat surfaces, but Naughty Dog wanted their characters and world to interact in a much more detailed fashion. So Gavin and Baggett rang one of their friends from MIT to ask what high-detail collision detection solutions were kicking around at that time. The next day, their friend called back and said he had the perfect solution. Unfortunately, it demanded a Cray supercomputer and possibly thousands of PlayStation's worth of memory to work in real time. Gavin and Baggett hung up the phone and started coming up with something of their own. They spent the better part of 9 months writing and rewriting the entire system half a dozen times in the process. This was one area where Baggett thought they might actually just fail, but once again, Cerny ended up coming to the rescue with his godlike assembly coding, according to Baggett. Cerny rewrote the collision detection system so that it was at least twice as fast, and it was just barely fast enough to work. It wasn't until around August 1995, almost a full year after production began, that they had levels that were even remotely playable in a fun way. Early on, they'd experimented with more open-level designs, whilst trying to emulate the fast-paced rhythmic gameplay of classic 16-bit platformers, but they realised that in an open 3D space, you could just run around the obstacles and enemies. It was also easier to get lost or get attacked off screen, so they decided to restrict one dimension of freedom, like the X-axis, to create a more linear corridor structure, which helped to solve these problems and focus the gameplay on the challenges that came at you head-on. They also solved the ass problem by having Crash start by facing the screen, along with having traditional 2D side-scrolling levels that showed Crash from the side, and having levels where the player ran towards the camera, like the Boulder Chase levels. Their first 2 test levels were a jungle and a lava cave, which, in the words of Gavin, were abject failures, just total disasters. The problem with the jungle level was that it was simply too large. There was no way they were going to fit it into memory, and there was virtually no gameplay to speak of. So they decided to make a much simpler level, the lava cave, and tried to make it fun. While certainly an improvement, it once again played terribly because of another problem they discovered in regards to depth perception. In 2D games, It was pretty straightforward to judge the distance of a jump, because you'd only really judge your movement in one dimension. But in 3D, you were looking over the shoulder of the main character and judging depth at an odd angle that might also be changing. Nobody could land the jumps successfully. It was around this time that Cerny told them that they needed to make a fun level, and so they drew up plans for 3 new levels, with 3 different strategies for fun, based on the lessons they'd learned from their 2 failed attempts. Most of the art design was complete by this point, but they chose to skip about 2/3 of the game and use Cortex's factory levels to really focus on fun. Their first successful level was Heavy Machinery, which was one of the game's 2D side-scrolling levels. They combined some classic elements, like steam vents, hot pipes, and enemies that tracked back and forth in simple patterns. This was in essence a retreat to success, as it employed the basic kind of techniques that games like Donkey Kong Country had used so successfully. But it worked. At the same time, they were also doing a more ambitious level where Crash walked both into and out of the screen, as well as side to side, which became Generator Room. This level featured moving platforms, drop platforms, hazardous pipes, and robotic enemies. By using a more mechanic setting, and briefly forgoing the complex organic forest designs, they were able to distill the 2-axis gameplay and make it fun. The third level, Cortex Power, positioned the camera behind Crash at an almost top-down angle. By taking some of the new creatures and mechanics and combining them with hot pipes and toxic slime pits, they were able to make it work where they had previously failed with their Jungle and Lava Cave levels. Having learned these lessons, the team then turned their attention back to the jungle design with a brand new level, Jungle Rollers. This level used some of the pieces from their failed jungle level, but arranged as a corridor between the trees, much like the over-the-shoulder factory level. They utilised pits, skunks on paths, stationary plants, and rollers to create a palette of obstacles. With this level, the into-the-screen gameplay really came into its own. Each element served its purpose, with the big stone rollers providing timing gates that could be doubled or tripled up for more challenge. Skunks tracked back and forth towards the player, requiring Crash to spin attack them or jump over them, and stationary plants could strike at the player, requiring one to bait them into a strike and then jump on their heads. In the end, this level wasn't that different in gameplay design from their factory levels, but starting with the jungle was too big of a leap. They needed simple, and upon simple, they built complex. This entire level design process was highly iterative. Creatures, layouts, and mechanics were all scrapped and reworked on a daily basis in pursuit of a fun experience. Almost none of this started on paper, but rather involved in-game trial and error by their level designers Kurosaki, Raffi, and Rubin, working with programmers Gavin and Baggett. The documented level layouts and gameplay mechanics were almost always done after the creation process had settled down to playable levels. For each level art design, like Jungle, they would typically do 2 to 3 levels. The first being an introductory set of challenges, and then later ones adding in a few new twists, combined with a much harder difficulty. A few of their most popular levels, like the Boulder Chase levels, were ideas that they sort of stumbled onto as variants of the over-the-shoulder level type. This particular level type actually caused a lot of arguments internally. There were those that felt that it simply wasn't going to work, that you weren't going to be able to see enough in front of you, but they went for it, taking inspiration from Raiders of the Lost Ark, and it proved so successful that they riffed on it again in subsequent games. A similar thing happened with Hog Wild, a level where Crash jumps onto the back of a wild boar and is dragged at high speed through a frantic series of obstacles. One of Rubin's levels, Road to Nowhere, was originally so difficult that it was practically impossible to clear without him sitting right next to you, so they had somebody else come in to redo it. Similarly, Stormy Ascent, one of Kurosaki's levels, had to be cut from the game entirely due to it being so insanely difficult that even he struggled with it. It was one of the last levels Kurosaki finished, and as they were preparing to deliver their Gold Master for manufacturing, the decision was made to cut it as they ran out of time to make it easier. It remained on the disc though, as it was less risky to just leave it in, rather than trying to remove it. Of course, it wasn't enough for them to design and play these levels themselves, as not only did they know what to do when they played it, they were also predisposed to like it. So they handed Crash over to an ever-rotating list of secretaries and clerical staff that worked at Universal. For many of them, it was their first time touching a controller, and they succeeded immediately in failing to clear a single challenge. As they smiled and tried to be positive, their hands were telling a different story. It was only when they started completing challenges and smiling while playing that Naughty Dog knew they were actually getting somewhere. There were also growing pains when it came to the gameplay. Gavin started programming the control of Crash early on, as this was the single most important thing to get right in a character action game, and while intellectually he knew this from doing Way of the Warrior, it was Cerny who really drove the message home. Cerny helped with the tuning to ensure Crash felt just right, and would comment on things like him not stopping fast enough, or Crash needing to be able to jump for a frame or two after he's run off a cliff, otherwise it'll be frustrating, etc. Rubin was also good at spotting flaws, which was essential in nailing the look and feel of the character, but the gameplay also changed a lot over the course of development. Crash's moveset, for example, was originally planned to be much more robust, with him being able to pick up and throw collected fruit, the ability to roll, kick, skip and eat, as well as being able to express a wide variety of emotions, like crying, frowning, laughing, etc. Crash was also originally supposed to swim when coming into contact with water, as well as climb up and down vines and ladders, and also be able to ride in minecarts. If the player remained idle for 2 minutes, a lightning strike was supposed to come down to kill Crash, resulting in a lost life, while defeating 20 enemies in a row would have granted the player an extra life. There was even a special action planned for slamming an enemy into the ground if the player was mid-air and pressed the jump button again before landing on the enemy. Doing so might release an item that Crash could then collect. Enemies carrying items or weapons could also be disarmed by pressing the jump and action buttons at the same time whilst approaching them, which would cause Crash to slide into them. If Crash picked up a weapon, he'd break it, and a voice line would play saying something like, "Weapon no good." A wide range of power-ups and collectibles were also initially planned for the game that were either changed or scrapped entirely. Instead of the iconic Wumpa fruit, Crash originally featured an assortment of more familiar-looking fruits, including coconuts, mangoes, strawberries, limes, and pineapples, each of which was worth incrementally higher amounts, with coconuts being worth only 1 fruit, while pineapples were worth 5. These fruits remained in the game for over a year before the decision was made to scrap them in favour of something simpler. They only had so much texture memory to work with, which meant each fruit got very little, and they didn't look great. They eventually decided to spend all of that memory on a single fruit and make it look really good, which became the Wumpa fruit. Rendering the Wumpa fruit in 3D wasn't feasible, as it would have required a lot of polygons, so they rendered out all of the rotations into a series of textures, which allowed them to place lots of them on screen. There were also originally plans for different flower power-ups that would boost Crash's abilities. Spring flowers would allow Crash to jump 50% higher, pepper flowers would extend Crash's spinning attack to twice the duration, special flowers would increase Crash's speed by 50%, and cactus flowers would cause Crash to take damage if collected. There were also small schools that would kill Crash upon touch, but jumping onto 3 of them would grant Crash invincibility for 10 seconds instead. Large schools would behave similarly, except Crash would only need to jump on 1 of them to grant invincibility. Alongside these collectibles were 6 voodoo masks that Crash could wear to grant different effects. The Scare mask would cause enemies to run away from Crash. The Magic mask would cause Crash to defeat enemies on touch. The Freeze mask would prevent enemies from moving. The Speed mask would cause Crash to run very fast and also be invincible. The Silly mask would turn Crash's spinning attack into a belly flop move that would hurl enemies in the opposite direction. And finally, the Laughing mask would cause Crash to laugh continuously, drawing enemies towards him. Each mask would last for a set amount of time, ranging from 10 to 20 seconds. A number of other collectibles were also planned, including a lightning bolt icon that would cause the screen to darken and rain a shower of lightning bolts, killing all enemies on screen, bubbling blue and red beakers that would allow Crash to sustain twice the normal damage and cause Crash to shrink by 200% respectively, and finally Yin Yang Yuck tokens that would be hidden throughout a level. If 100 of these symbols were found, then a Way of the Wombat minigame would unlock after beating the game. That was presumably a fighting game in the style of their previous title, Way of the Warrior. Aku Aku would have also been summoned quite differently, with Crash needing to touch a white stone block that comes up from underground as he approaches. Touching additional white stone blocks would then increase Aku Aku's strength up to 5 times. Phase 1 would have him take 1 hit of damage for you. Phase 2 had him attacking enemies that were within 3 units of distance from Crash, with 1 unit of distance being equal to 1 crash. Enemies would be defeated in 3 hits. Phase 3 was the same, but now enemies would be defeated in a single attack. Phase 4 was similar to Phase 3, but doubling Aku Aku's attack range. And finally, Phase 5 would cause Aku Aku to glow brightly and grant Crash invincibility for 10 seconds. There were also bluestone blocks that, when touched, would cause a letter to appear. Collecting the letters MCA for Music Corporation of America, UIS for Universal Interactive Studios, or DOG for Naughty Dog, awarded the player with 5, 3, or 1 extra life, respectively. There were also redstone blocks that would cause Crash to take damage if touched. Referred to as simply Witch Doctor during development, Aku Aku was initially quite different from how he appears in the final game. He was originally considered to be a fairy or genie, not necessarily a voodoo mask. Even when the idea to make him a voodoo mask came about, he was initially conceived as an old man who wore the voodoo mask, as opposed to it magically floating around on its own. He'd not only provide protection for Crash, but also offer helpful advice. The decision to make him a standalone voodoo mask stemmed from technical limitations. They didn't have a lot of polygons to spare, so Aku Aku was created the way he was as a low poly solution. The name Aku Aku came from a Polynesian restaurant that resided near the Alewife train station back when Gavin, Rubin and Baggett lived in the Boston area. The restaurant featured a giant tiki statue out front, and according to Baggett, had fairly terrible food. The game was originally planned to ship by Christmas 1995, however everybody knew that wasn't going to happen because by summer 95, they had just barely reached first playable. At this point, it was still just Naughty Dog and Universal, which meant that fundamentally there were 2 people they interacted with, Robert Binius, who was the business guy, and Mark Cerny, who was technical and design. Cerny was realistic about what could actually be done, while Binius didn't really know much about it. Gavin and Rubin had an arrogant half-hope that if they made a mascot-style game for the PlayStation, they could pitch it to Sony as their answer to Mario. Sometime around Thanksgiving 1995, Gavin and Kurizaki took footage from the game and spent 2 days creating a preview tape to give to Sony, set to Igor Stravinsky's 1913 ballet and orchestral piece, The Rite of Spring. They purposely timed every jump and strike of Crash to the bombastic instrumental hits, and intensely edited the footage, because the gameplay wasn't great raw. Crash's signature crates hadn't been implemented yet, so the levels tended to look quite sparse. They then took this tape and handed it over to a friend at Sony, so that the top brass would see it. At this point in time, Sony wasn't even aware of Crash's existence. Naughty Dog had signed an unusual deal with them as an independent developer, whereby they were still able to procure PS1 dev kits, but didn't have the rights to publish their game. The upside to this arrangement, however, was that Naughty Dog didn't need to show Sony anything, and were free to develop Crash in isolation. So when Sony saw Crash, there was this fairly immediate buzz surrounding the game, because it was better looking than anything else they'd seen in development. Kelly Flock was the first Sony employee to see the game in person, and was presumably sent to check if the tape they'd received was actually legitimate. The first thing that freaked him out was the idea that the game was constantly reading from the disc at 300 kilobytes a second, because their models of how long the PlayStation CD drive would last were based on occasional access, not constant access. There was a very real concern that if they shipped the game, all PlayStations in the world would break from overuse. Fortunately, there were never any issues with CD-ROMs failing on the PS1, and it turned out that Sony's estimates of the mean time between failures was very conservative. Bernie Stolar, the then Executive Vice President of Sony Computer Entertainment America, saw huge potential in the title, and played a significant role in bringing Crash into the PlayStation family. So much so, that Sony began negotiating with Universal for the exclusive publishing rights to the game. While these negotiations were taking place, development of the game continued, and in January 1996, they hit upon an idea that would become a core staple of the Crash Bandicoot series. Even though the gameplay worked, their levels were missing something. They'd spent so many polygons on their detailed backgrounds and cartoony characters that they couldn't have a lot of enemies next to each other, and that meant that there was a lot of running between them. They'd created the Wumpa Fruit pickup, and they were fine, but not super exciting. Enter crates. One Saturday, while Gavin and Rubin were driving to work, they were thinking that they needed more gameplay because players were finishing the levels too fast, but they also needed it to be low poly because they had little polygons to spare. Rubin suggested boxes, and as the duo started thinking about that, they realised that you could do a lot of things with them. They could have different things inside them, they could stack and interact with each other, they could be used as switches to trigger other things, they could drop down in stacks, and you could create puzzles out of them, such as the extra life crate sandwiched between two TNT crates. It also felt good to break them, thus filling the boring bits of the level, and the puzzles would slow the player down. For what was such a simple object, they proved to be incredibly versatile. So after arriving at the office, they scrapped whatever else they had planned to do that day, and Gavin started coding the crates, while Ruben modelled and textured them. By the end of the day, they pretty much had all of the basic block types that shipped in the final game. Over the next few days, they threw crates into levels with reckless abandon, and formerly dull areas with nothing to do became great fun. On the 21st of March 1996, Sony Computer Entertainment America and Universal Interactive Studios announced an exclusive worldwide license agreement that gave Sony publishing and distribution rights of Crash Bandicoot. The game was set to be unveiled at Sony's E3 booth in May at the Los Angeles Convention Center, giving them a little less than 2 months to prepare. Heading into E3, Naughty Dog worked relentlessly to make the whole game presentable. Super Mario 64 had been shown off a few months prior, and going into the event, they knew that they'd be going up against Shigeru Miyamoto's next masterpiece. The fear of Miyamoto was thick at Naughty Dog during the entire Crash development period. They had subscriptions to all of the Japanese video game magazines because they were always ahead of the US ones, and they'd frantically look through them the day they came in to carefully study every 3D character action game. At first, they were concerned about potential competition, particularly on the PlayStation, but as time passed, their fears somewhat subsided, as a lot of the examples that came out kind of sucked. But they knew Mario wasn't going to suck. Prior to E3, they started seeing footage of the game, and it was immediately obvious that it was a different type of game to theirs, something that was truly open. That scared them, but when they saw the blocky, simple open world, they breathed a sigh of relief. Of course, they hadn't played it, so they couldn't pass judgment until they did, and that wouldn't happen until E3. What they couldn't anticipate, however, was Sony booting off one of their own internal products, Twisted Metal 2, in order to give Crash the prime spot on the show floor, right across from where Super Mario 64 was being demoed. As the show opened, and Ruben stood next to Crash, many people came up to their booth and started playing it, including none other than Miyamoto himself. It was a very special moment for Naughty Dog to see Miyamoto playing Crash, and according to Baggett, he apparently said that the water effects were beautiful. Crowds of programmers from other teams also stood around their booth, trying to figure out how in the hell they were drawing so much. There was a genuine belief amongst some of them that the footage had been faked, and what people were playing wasn't actually real gameplay, or that they were using some sort of secret Sony library, which was particularly funny, given that Naughty Dog explicitly went out of their way not to use Sony's libraries for being too slow. While their E3 event had seemingly gone off without a hitch, behind closed doors, tensions had been steadily brewing between Universal and Naughty Dog. When Universal Interactive realised that Crash was kind of a big deal, they started trying to take credit for the product. Leaked copies of the temporary box cover and press materials for E3 were mysteriously missing Naughty Dog's logo, which was in breach of their contract. In response to this, Ruben drafted and printed 1,000 copies of a glitzy document titled Naughty Dog, creator and developer of Crash Bandicoot, that he intended to hand out in front of their Crash display at E3. As a courtesy, he sent these flyers to Universal for review, and upon seeing it, their management allegedly flew off the handle. Cerny, despite being an employee of Universal Interactive, was completely uninvolved in any of this chicanery, so times like these were often hardest on him than anyone else. This friction was also felt when it came time to name Crash. Sometime before Sony had acquired the publishing rights to Crash, back when the game was still called Willy the Wombat, Universal had done trademark searches and discovered that the name had already been taken by Hudson Soft for its upcoming Sega Saturn Japanese exclusive action puzzle platformer. So a meeting was held between Universal and Naughty Dog to decide on a new name. They had another character in the game, called Pinstriped Bandicoot, later renamed to Pinstripe Potteroo, and Naughty Dog liked how Bandicoot sounded. They also figured that if the game was basically going to be his name, then it needed to say something about what he does and what his personality was like. Baggett and Kurosaki sat at Baggett's desk and listed all of the possible verbs that they thought would make for a good name, like smash, bash, dash, etc. When they landed on Crash Bandicoot, they knew that was it. Naughty Dog held a meeting and put the name to a vote, and it was unanimous. They then put that name forward in their meeting with Universal. Universal's marketing director, Kelly Flaherty, also put forward several names that Universal was considering, including Wezzles the Wombat, Wuzzles the Wombat, and Ozzy the Otzel. This was another point of contention between the two companies. It wasn't exactly clear who had the right to name the character, but Universal was adamant that as producer, they'd be the ones to decide the final name, and Naughty Dog was having none of that. Fortunately, after much yelling, Naughty Dog prevailed, and Crash Bandicoot became Crash Bandicoot. The game's music was yet another point of contention between Universal and Naughty Dog. In typical video game development fashion, the music had been left to the last minute and needed to be quickly cobbled together before E3. This task had been assigned to their Universal producer, David Siller, who proposed that instead of conventional music, they create something called the Urban Chaotic Symphony, in which a variety of sound effects consisting of bird chirps, car honks, grunts, and farting noises were randomly selected and combined. When Naughty Dog rejected this innovative proposal, they were introduced to Mark Mothersbaugh and his studio, Mutaho Musica. He and mostly Josh Mansell composed all of the music for the game, with Baggett serving as their music producer because nobody else wanted to do it or had the background. At the time, Mansell was working as an in-house composer at Mutaho Musica. He had recently completed the music for the Johnny Mnemonic video game, and Mothersbaugh thought he'd be a good fit for the Crash project. After meeting with Universal and Naughty Dog, Mansell delivered 4 demos in February 1996. 2 were really catchy and cartoony, while the other 2 were a little bit more experimental and mood-based. This was because Universal and Naughty Dog butted heads about how the music should sound, with Universal wanting something more traditional, while Naughty Dog wanted something more ambient. Mansell had to find a way to please both. Early on, Naughty Dog gave Mansell a copy of Crash's production Bible that detailed all of the characters in the game, their backstories, and a loose telling of the game's story, as well as a cassette of Dead Can Dance to listen to, which helped him better understand what it was they were after. For each composition, he had access to either an artist's render of the level or character, a verbal description, a videotape of someone playing the level, or sometimes all 3. After assessing the visual environment and gameplay intensity, he would build a percussion track that felt right tempo-wise, and then choose an instrument palette that he felt reflected the level. But it wasn't until he composed the music for Hog Wild that things really started to click. Prior to this, the reaction to his tracks was split, as Naughty Dog and Universal were both looking for different things, but the Hog Wild track was more comical. People were laughing while listening to it, and it started feeling as though there was more of a positive reaction. Mansell would write music during the week, and Baggett would come up on Friday afternoons to listen to what he was working on, offering up ideas and possibly some revision notes, as well as what the general consensus at Naughty Dog was. The two shared a similar taste in music and sense of humour, so they got along really well. The sound effects for the game were done by Mike Golem, along with Ron Horwitz and Kevin Spears at Universal Studios, with the characters' voices being provided by Brendan O'Brien. When they were trying to figure out what the game should sound like, they explored a bunch of different options, like taking a sound from a library or recording their voices imitating a sound effect. The real challenge was getting the sound effects and music into the game, whilst ensuring it still sounded good. Most of the PlayStation's limited memory had been allocated to graphics, so only a small amount was left over for music and sound effects. Baggett had to take every sound and composition and adjust its sample rate to get the smallest file possible that still sounded good. Dan Colmorgan, Naughty Dog's sound engineer, had a semi-automated process that would generate all of the samples that were chosen for a particular song. He'd then have it crank out the samples at different sample rates. Some sounds were able to be played at a lower sample rate and still reproduce the original sound fairly accurately, while others would just get totally trashed. It was an art to get it just right. The game's cutscenes were almost single-handedly made by Jason Rubin. During development, Rubin taught himself how to animate in a classic Disney style of animation, using a book called The Illusion of Life by Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnson. He had the book open on his desk and taught himself how to animate in that classic style while putting the cutscenes together. Gavin and Rubin originally had greater ambitions for Crash's story that never ended up materializing, mainly because the technology wasn't there yet on the original PlayStation, and they didn't have the budget either. Very early on, they had decided that they really wanted the game to be story-driven. They had written the entire story for Crash, and were going back and forth between the game and cutscenes. Originally, every character had a backstory, there was morality to the game, there was an environmental lesson in the story, and they were going to add commentary on current events. According to an internal Project Wombat concept document, the opening cutscene originally featured Crash speaking, quote, in a pastiche of bizarre non-sequiturs drawn from literature, pop culture, radio, television, politics, and movies. He's Rambo one moment, Winston Churchill or Fred Flintstone the next. Yet though they seem random at first, his citations are always strangely appropriate. Some of these personalities included a fast-talking huckster, Dirty Harry, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and his iconic Terminator catchphrase, "I'll be back," and a heroic Dudley Do-Right voice, saying, "Don't worry my love, I shall return." None of this made it into the final game, however. The opening and closing cutscenes were originally traditionally animated full-motion videos, but they weren't used in the final game, as once Sony acquired the publishing rights from Universal, they felt as though a 2D cartoon would be out of place in a 3D platformer, and so they were changed to in-game cinematics instead. Crash Bandicoot was released in North America on the 9th of September 1996 to generally positive reviews, but with the game having released so close to Super Mario 64, the press often made unfavourable comparisons to it, with Next Generation magazine calling it, quote, the single most derivative game to ever hit a console, and anyone who's played even one side-scrolling action game could have come up with every single game element found in Crash. Other reviewers were disappointed by the game's linear levels and lack of room for exploration, but appreciated the shifting camera perspectives between levels. Crash Bandicoot was a commercial success, with it selling over 2.8 million copies worldwide by February 1998, and shipping 4.5 million copies worldwide by February 1999. Amy Blair was the Sony Computer Entertainment marketing manager for Crash, and together with Eric Moe and Chris Graves from their ad agency TBWA Chiat Day, they came up with the iconic ad of Crash yelling at Nintendo. The whole point of the ad was to challenge Mario, who had a huge portion of the market at the time. So they thought that maybe this Crash game was so amazing that it inspires a crazed fan to make an outfit of his favourite character and drive up to Nintendo to sort of harass them and challenge their mascot. The one rule they had was that they didn't want to directly insinuate that Crash was this person in the ad, because he wasn't. Crash doesn't know who Mario is, he doesn't play Mario games or anything like that, and mixing those things would have come off as weird and cheesy. So they went up to Seattle and shot a bunch of 10 to 15 second teasers of this crazed fan's journey to Nintendo. Then for the 30-second commercial, where Crash is at the parking lot, that would be the big showdown moment. However, it wasn't actually Nintendo's parking lot, according to Blair, rather it was the building next door. It was still a Nintendo building, it just wasn't their main headquarters, but it aligned well with the fun of the campaign. This fan was such a spur-of-the-moment kind of guy that he hadn't properly done his homework and mistakenly went to the wrong building. The ad gave Sony and Crash Bandicoot a really cool rebellious kind of attitude and managed to capture the attention of a lot of players at the time. In spite of the game's success, however, the development of Crash Bandicoot was brutal on the team, with a great deal of crunch involved whilst making it. It wasn't uncommon for those at Naughty Dog to work 16-hour days, 7 days a week, including holidays. They were eating breakfast, lunch and dinner at the office, and typically worked from 10 AM to 4 AM, unlike those at Universal who worked more conventional business hours. They'd roll out at 4 AM together, go to Jerry's Famous Deli, which was down the road from Universal, and they'd eat together, go home, sleep, come back to the office, and do it all over again. Justin Monet recalled how the team didn't even realise how much the crunch had affected them until they had their pictures taken for their website. As they were looking at the photos, they realised they looked like crap. Charlotte Francis had to Photoshop their eyes so that they didn't have huge dark circles under them. Korizaki recalled how his friends would go out to have fun, and when they got really deep into production, he couldn't join them because there simply wasn't any time to have a normal life. As Naughty Dog raked in the profits, Gavin and Rubin were able to offset the team's scars by giving out bonuses, which everyone referred to as the Golden Handcuffs. Naughty Dog's relationship with Joe Pearson and Charles Zimbillis also took a turn for the worse, following the release of Electronic Gaming Monthly's 85th issue in August 1996, which had a special feature covering the game. Towards the end was a small section titled The Secret Behind Crash's Flash, which had an interview with Jason Rubin regarding the development of the game. The magazine then stated that, quote, outside cartoon experts were even brought in to tweak the look of the game's cast of characters. When Pearson and Zimbalist saw this, they couldn't believe it. It implied that the two were brought on board as an afterthought, when in fact they were the first to put pencil to paper to get the ball rolling. Pearson was so upset at the misleading press that he terminated his relationship with Naughty Dog then and there. Zimbalist voiced his disapproval, but chose to continue working with Naughty Dog on future games, as he only worked about 3 days a month, but made enough to cover that month's expenses. Whenever he'd come into work, the corner conference room was cleared for him, and Universal Corporate would get miffed seeing this one guy taking up the entire room for a whole day. With the North American launch of Crash Bandicoot out of the way, they quickly turned their attention towards the European and Japanese versions. For the European version, they had to contend with the PAL video standard, which meant having a slightly higher resolution that ran at 50Hz instead of 60. For Crash, this meant that the frame rate would be 25 FPS instead of 30. Adjusting the game to the higher resolution wasn't much of a problem, but the slightly different aspect ratio of PAL pixels messed with their bitmap graphics and fonts. They didn't have any additional VRAM, so increasing the resolution of the sprites wasn't an option. Instead, they would just have to live with a slight aspect shift, or stretch them to fit. The real problem was the reduced frame rate. Their animations were sampled from Power Animator at 30 FPS, so Gavin needed to modify their tools to support making a second copy of every animation where the step rate was adjusted to 25 FPS. The PAL version then used these files instead of the originals. While this worked most of the time, it sometimes became necessary to notate a particular animation segment as having a strange or custom step for PAL, or even hand code certain frames. The game's physics and collision systems also needed to adjust to the different frame rate. Fortunately, when starting Crash, Gavin had already made the decision to not tie the game's physics to its frame rate, which really paid off with the PAL conversion. The final tricky part of the localization was the languages. In typical programmer fashion, Gavin made a system for this. All of the text was generated by strings in the Ghoul code, and since he controlled the compiler, he added a feature where a mapping file could be created for each language, specifying the English text and the equivalent phrases in each of their supported languages. He originally had it set up so that players could change the language on the fly, but Europe told him to change it because they didn't want to have to test for weird bugs that might crop up when you switch languages mid-level. Europe also made territory-specific requests, such as making the game more challenging, so Gavin modified their tools to allow territory-specific overrides in the files that controlled the game data, which made serving the producer's requests easier. For the Japanese version, they needed to make much more extensive changes. Up until this point, they had only dealt with Sony Computer Entertainment America, who understood Crash's vibe, but the Japanese were not so sure. They were told that executives from Japan were coming over to America in order to talk to them about the character. During their meeting, they were handed a document that compared Crash with Mario and the character Knights from Sega's Nights into Dreams, or what was known of the game at the time. Though Crash was rated favourably in graphics and some other categories, two things stood out as weaknesses. The first was that Sony Japan didn't like the character much, and the second was a column titled Heritage that listed Mario and Knights as Japanese and Crash as other. The two negatives were related. It's worth noting that back in the day, American games, if they even made their way to Japan at all, almost always flopped. Foreign games in Japan were referred to as Yoge, or Western games, which implied it had good graphics, but poor gameplay and comprehensibility. These lesser titles were usually stocked in a seedy back corner near the oddball porn games. In order to prevent this from happening to them, they were going to take the Japanese market very seriously with Crash. Cerny presided over the meeting, given that he spoke Japanese, but also because he was very well respected for his work on Sonic the Hedgehog 2 and for his years at Sega in Japan. Ruben could tell from the look in Cerny's eyes that their renders of Crash, made specifically for the meeting, did not impress the Japanese executives. They took a break, during which it was clear that Sony was only interested in Crash for the US market. Hardly a mascot crowning. Ruben stared at the renders they had done, primitive by today's standards, but still reasonably good looking, that had been retouched by Charlotte Francis for most of the previous 48 hours. She was exhausted. Ruben walked over to her and asked if she could close Crash's huge smiling mouth to make him seem less aggressive, change his eyes to two small black Pac-Man shapes, and make his hair spikes smaller. She had less than 15 minutes, but with her last ounce of strength, she managed to bang it out. Rubin then held up the resulting printout to the Japanese executives, and they immediately jumped on board. In order to assist Naughty Dog with the Japanese version, Sony assigned 2 producers to them, Shuhei Yoshida and Ropyaku Tsurumi, aka Tsurumi0600. They sat in on every major planning meeting, and scheduled the whole of fall 1996 for Naughty Dog to localize the game in exacting detail, as it was going to be sold and marketed like it had been made in Japan. To pull off this cultural masquerade, Gavin and Rubin decided that Yoshida and Tsurumi got pretty much whatever they wanted, since they knew the Japanese market. Naturally, this meant they had to translate all of the text. Some of this wasn't too bad, but the main logo was a 3D object that Rubin had to painstakingly recreate from a paper design that Japan had provided them, which required lots of checking from Tsurumi, as Rubin didn't speak Japanese. There were also a good number of cases throughout the game where they had placed text and textures, which all needed new versions. They collected all of these textures, shipped them out to Japan, and got back Tsurumi certified versions in exactly the same sizes with the Japanese text. Gavin, meanwhile, had to figure out how to cram the hiragana and katakana syllabaries into what little memory they had left. Japan then came up with the idea of having Aku Aku explain various gameplay mechanics to the player after breaking his boxes. This was a great idea, except it meant the game was suddenly filled with around 200 extra paragraphs of text that Gavin had to squeeze into the levels. There were also changes made to the game's music, as Japan felt as though the boss rounds, along with Torna's theme, needed to sound more video game-like. The only input they gave Mansell was that they wanted it to sound like the Main Street Electrical Parade at Disneyland. He didn't know what that was, but after asking around, he finally figured out that it was like Mario music. These music changes were requested by Sony Japan at the 11th hour, so Mansell only had about a day and a half to crank them out. It was such a short turnaround that he didn't really have time to get bummed out about it. After implementing all of these changes, along with several others, Crash Bandicoot launched in Japan in December 1996. In May 1997, Crash received the Gold Prize in Japan for sales of more than 500,000 units. Sony did an incredible job marketing the game, with the Crash TV commercials being among the funniest game commercials in Japan at the time. Megumi Hosoya was the product and marketing manager for Sony Computer Entertainment Inc., and the person behind the popular Crash dance for Crash's TV ads in Japan. The success of this campaign would influence Naughty Dog to incorporate the dance into future games. In October 1996, development of Crash Bandicoot 2 Cortex Strikes Back officially started, and with it came a number of staff changes. Back in Japan, the asset price bubble had burst catastrophically, and the effects of it just kept getting worse. Matsushita Electric, who had acquired MCA in 1990, decided to cut their losses and sold 80% of MCA's shares to Canadian beverage company Seagram in 1995. With new owners meant new management, and over the next 2 years, several changes were made to the media giant. The MCA name was dropped, and the company was renamed to Universal Studios Inc. Universal Interactive became a part of a new nebulous division called Universal Studios' New Media Group, led by Paul Ryu. In late 1996, Robert Binias and David Siller left Universal, leaving Cerny to assume both of their roles as president of Universal Interactive and Crash's producer. Naughty Dog also underwent several staff changes of its own. The success of Crash had put Naughty Dog under huge pressure to deliver a sequel straight away, which disrupted the schedule that the team had originally settled on. Crash 2 was supposed to have had another 2-year dev cycle, and so because of this, Kurosaki began designing a whole new control scheme for Crash. He would have been able to do a lot of different moves, and they were even planning on adding the ability to press a button and completely turn the camera around 180 degrees. Kurosaki was looking forward to this, along with the prospect of going back to a year of somewhat normal hours to try and put his life back together. When he received word that Crash 2 would now be shipping in 1997 instead, and that all of these new features would end up being shelved due to time constraints, he decided to leave the company, as that wasn't something he was ready to endure. Dan Kollmorgen similarly left the company, and went on to join Heavy Iron Studios, that would be responsible for the creation of a number of licensed video game titles, based on popular Disney, Warner Bros. And Nickelodeon franchises. Over the coming months, Naughty Dog hired a bunch of new employees, including Stephen White, Greg Omi, Eric Iwasaki, Eric Pongilinen, Rob Titus, Joe Leby II, and Dan Array. The original Crash Bandicoot was a technical marvel, delivering high-quality graphics at 30 FPS. Nevertheless, for Crash 2 they wanted to put twice as much on screen, while still maintaining that frame rate. To accomplish this, they rewrote approximately 80% of their game engine and tool code. They did it module by module to allow for continuous development of the game's levels. The Ghoul interpreter was recoded into assembly, and the compiler was modified for even better performance. Ghoul 2 could handle twice the polygon count and ran 3 times faster. Their workstation-based tools pipeline had played a crucial role in the creation of the first game, so for Crash 2, they built their new tools pipeline around a consistent database structure that was designed to allow the evolution of level databases, automatic I/O for complex data types, data browsing and searching, and a number of other features. Various restrictions of the Crash 1 drawing pipeline were removed, allowing them to support the easy addition of arbitrary new types of data to various objects, without outdating old information. In order to fit the even larger Crash 2 levels into memory, they had to increase the efficiency of their virtual memory scheme even more. They rewrote the code that laid out the CD, employing several new algorithms, and carefully rearranged game data structures to aid the engine in loading and processing them in the most efficient way. Crash 2 also had several times the amount of animation of the first game, with over 9,000 individual frames at 30 FPS, so complicated compression and caching schemes were explored to both reduce storage size and to speed up the code. These changes allowed for almost every death in the game to have its own unique animation. They added more flexibility and features to their game engine, such as procedural rain that appeared to come down through the environment as if it were real, a specular renderer for the gems that made them appear shinier, and reflections in the ice that added depth to Crash and everything else in the environment. Greg Omi even created a pseudo-software Z-buffer that allowed for pixel-perfect subdivision by a flat plane. Z-buffering is a technique used in 3D computer graphics to manage the depth of objects in a scene, ensuring closer objects obscure distant ones. The one Naughty Dog created was fairly limited in that any water surface had to be exactly flat on the y-axis, so there couldn't be any waves, and the subdividing plane couldn't be at weird angles. They mainly used it on Crash, an enemy or two, and a few boxes at a time, but it was still nevertheless a remarkable achievement for the PS1, which didn't have a hardware Z-buffer like the Nintendo 64. By far the most significant bottleneck when making the first game was the overall time it took the team to build and tune a level, so for Crash 2, they took a serious look at this process and attempted to improve it. They fixed a number of workflow issues that new hires like Rob Titus had run into. On his first day, Bob Raffi showed Titus how to use Neaten, a proprietary tool that forced and rotated the game's textures. Naughty Dog was doing UV texture mapping completely differently from every other studio, and so Titus asked Raffi why they were doing it like this. Raffi then responded by asking how he'd do it, so Titus launched Power Animator, opened the geometry, clicked on a single button, and the whole thing was done in about a second. Raffi couldn't believe what he'd just witnessed. He called Gavin over, and they quickly added the ability to read UV data from Power Animator to the Crash 2 engine. The specification of different resources in the level was exceedingly tedious, so they added a number of modules to the tool's pipeline designed to automatically balance and distribute many of these resources, as well as auto-calculate the active ranges of objects and other resources that had to be controlled manually in the first game. Additionally, they moved the specification of the camera, camera info, game objects, and game object info into new text-based configuration files, which allowed the programmers and designers to edit and add information quickly and easily. Because of all of this, Crash 2's levels were about twice as large, had integrated bonus stages, more branches, hard paths, and 3 or 4 times the amount of creatures, with many more settable parameters. For Crash 2, Cerny really wanted to get into design, and so he set himself a target of doing a third of the game's levels, only to end up doing around 90% of them. They took feedback they'd received from players, as well as what they'd learned from making the first game, and used this to sharpen the focus of gameplay in the sequel. The snow levels were some of the more memorable locales in Crash 2, thanks to them being chock full of effects, like falling snow and reflective ice. The sewer levels came about because they wanted to have some dirty locations in the game, and what was dirtier than a sewer? Colour contrast was added to show depth, and to break up the repetitive monotony look of the endless sewer pipes. Since Crash's trademark environment was the jungle, they knew they had to bring them back for the second game, but they wanted something that was obviously new, so they added mushrooms to the environment. The engine boss fight caused quite the commotion between the programmers and the animators, as they ran out of memory for animation, which is why Crash just spawns Wumpa Fruits out of his body, and the animators weren't happy about it. They also made a conscious decision not to use fog to hide polygons, as was commonplace at the time, due to how magazines brutalized other developers for its use. Instead, they went in the complete opposite direction and ensured that there would be no fog whatsoever in Crash 2. Crash retained all of its moves from the first game, but gained a number of additional moves, such as crawling, sliding, body slamming, etc. Crash also had a number of new control specs, like the jetboard, jetpack, underground digging, and hanging. More powerful jumps allowed for more verticality and platforms that were further apart, while body slamming and sliding attacks allowed Crash to take out foes from either above or below. According to Dana Ray, the body slam move came from WWE. Everybody at Naughty Dog loved the crazy over-the-top world of professional wrestling, so the body slam was taken from that, as they felt it was a perfect fit for Crash. The camera was one of the things in the original game that they were the least satisfied with, so in order to make Crash 2 feel more lifelike, they allowed the camera to look around much more freely and supported a much wider set of branching and transition cameras. In addition, arbitrary parameterized information was added to the camera system, so that at any location, the camera had more than 100 possible settable options. Crash 1 had been criticized for its hard difficulty, so for Crash 2, they wanted to have a more even and carefully constructed level of difficulty progression. To achieve this, they implemented a form of dynamic difficulty adjustment that would rebalance the game based on how poorly you were playing. The system knew how many times you were dying in any one level, and where, and could change the contents of question mark crates to give players a helping hand. For most players, the contents of these crates would just be a bunch of Wumpa Fruit, but for players who were struggling, the game might award the player with an Aku Aku mask, an extra life, or a continued checkpoint instead. For the boulder chase levels, they could change the speed at which the boulder chased you, so if you kept dying repeatedly, they would gradually slow the boulder down a little each time. By doing this, they could create a game in which everyone could succeed, regardless of a player's individual skill level. Something else new to Crash 2 was the introduction of the Warp Room, small hubs containing a selection of stages for the player to choose from in any order they'd like. A process Naughty Dog dubbed wide linear. They were trying to break the standard linear mold of the first game, but they knew they weren't going to be wide open like Super Mario 64 because they wanted to control the gameplay. They used the term wide linear because it allowed for some choice, but not total freedom. The linear island map used in the first game had been a pain to create for a number of reasons, one of which being that it took forever to model, so for Crash 2, they wanted something better. The warp rooms ended up being real time savers, which was important given the incredibly short amount of time they had to finish the game. The decision to have hubs containing a selection of stages created a need for players to have a method of unlocking new hubs. The solution chosen was to require a crystal to be collected from each level in a hub to complete it, but they chose to hide some crystals down left or right paths because they really wanted players to explore. Their levels had taken a lot of work to design, so they wanted to reuse them as much as possible. Bob Raffi would sketch them out, while Eric Pongilinan modelled them, and then put them together within a couple of hours. The warp rooms were assembled very quickly towards the beginning of the project, because they needed a place to put the levels in as they finished them. The decision to create an enclosed space, instead of something more open, was to free up extra polygons for the holographic videos that pop up to tell the game's story. The hub system allowed them to tell a story in small chunks, and the holographic videos were particularly cool because they were a combination of the team's efforts. There were the artists and animators who had to do things like the facial expressions, lip syncing, and textures, while the programmers did things like the holographic effect, lens flare, and video spooling. It all needed to come together to bring an artificial character to life in a way none of them had seen in a video game before. Another notable change between the first game and its sequel was the absence of Crash's girlfriend, Torna, and the introduction of Crash's sister, Coco. The design of Torna had been hotly contested during the first game's development due to a sexually explicit design that was reminiscent of Jessica Rabbit and Pamela Anderson, which felt out of place in an otherwise child-friendly game. Her initial character sketches were even more explicit, but the marketing director at Universal, Kelly Flaherty, had Naughty Dog tone down her design in the final game. Unlike the time they fought with Universal over Crash's name, Torna wasn't worth fighting for, as she wasn't the most inspired of their character designs, and they had learned to choose their battles wisely. The second, and arguably more important reason for her removal, stemmed from their relationship with Sony. Sony Japan didn't feel comfortable having a super sexy character with Crash, and instead wanted a safer character, one that didn't have strong sexual undertones. According to Shuhei Yoshida, when they were doing playtesting in Japan, one kid saw her and asked, "Who's this middle-aged woman?" So she was deemed too old to be a heroine for a young Japanese audience. Coco's design started by gathering artists within Yoshida's group at Sony Computer Entertainment Inc.'s product development department to come up with illustrations for what Crash's little sister would look like to be sent to Naughty Dog. The idea was that Japanese artists would draw the concepts first, so as to keep elements that were sensible for a Japanese audience, which would then be adapted by Charles Zimbalist. Graphic artists Takemitsu Iijima and Taichi Ogawa from the Ape Escape team were asked to work on the initial character design. Then Zimbalist took those concepts and refined them, with oversight from Ropyaku Surumi. Her overalls, with the straps off the dominant arm, were made to make her look active, while her thick-soled sneakers and laptop were a fad in Japan in the 90s. According to Rob Titus, the woman who did the original voice for Coco and Crash 2, Vicky Winters, was what one would describe today as thirsty. It was her first voice acting gig, but afterwards she kept stalking Rubin and calling him to try to get more work. Months later, Titus was watching the morning news, where they were doing a live broadcast at a gas station in Hollywood. Next thing he knew, there she was. She took the microphone and just started rambling live on TV. Needless to say, she wasn't invited to the launch party, and was replaced for all future games. Crash Bandicoot 2: Cortex Strikes Back launched on the 6th of November 1997 in North America to critical and commercial acclaim, with reviewers praising the game's graphical enhancements, variety of levels, and improvements to Crash's gameplay. It was seen by many as not only superior to its predecessor, but in a league of its own among PlayStation titles. By March 1998, Crash 2 had sold more than 2.1 million copies worldwide, with the Crash Bandicoot series as a whole surpassing 5 million copies. In Japan, Crash 2 received the Gold Prize for sales of more than 500,000 units, just like its predecessor, with it selling over 800,000 copies in the region, and by February 1999, the game had shipped more than 4 million copies worldwide. However, this success, much like with the first game, came at a cost. The crunch the team suffered during the development of Crash 2 was even worse than the first, with Rubin reportedly being in the office 364 days out of 365 in 1997, averaging 16 hours a day on the computer, according to its logs. The single day that he was out was during the worst part of a bad cold. Lunch that year came out of vending machines more days than most. Gavin, meanwhile, didn't miss a single day that entire year. During that stretch of time, he hadn't gone into a single store, whether it was a grocery store or a coffee shop. If he needed something from home, someone else had to bring it for him because he couldn't leave the office. They went from one crunch to another, which was the downside of being successful. During their Christmas break of '96, back when development of Crash 2 had not long started, the server hard drive caught fire, requiring them to restore everything from a backup. The stress was enough to kill Gavin, but fortunately they got it all back. In December 1997, a month after Crash 2's North American launch, the team took a month off to recover, with the exception of Gavin and Rubin, who were on a Japanese press tour. For some, this was their first break in 3 years. By the time January 1998 rolled around, development had started on Crash Bandicoot Warped, giving the team just 9 months to finish the game. The tight deadline and smaller programming staff required them to explore options for even greater efficiency. Their reduction in programmers was due to them beginning pre-production on their next game, codenamed Project X, later known as Crash Team Racing, which they needed to get an early start on to ensure the technology was in place. This was the first time that 2 projects were concurrently in development at Naughty Dog. Crash 3's rigid production schedule required the team to complete a level every week. In order to facilitate this, they wrote an interactive listener which allowed GUI-based game objects to be dynamically examined, debugged, and tuned. They were then able to set the parameters and features of objects in real time, greatly improving their ability to tune and debug levels. Various other visual debugging and diagnostic techniques were also introduced as well. In addition, they made improvements to their localization pipeline to ensure their European version could support multiple languages, both text and speech, including lip syncing, and that it was entirely retimed and the animation resampled for 25 FPS. The Ghoul language was also expanded to allow for near-automatic conversion of character control timing for power regions. The Japanese version, on the other hand, had Pocket Station support, a complete language translation, and a number of additional country-specific features. DualShock support was also added everywhere where the team thought the game warranted it. Several new employees joined the Naughty Dog team, including Malcolm He, Daniel Chan, and Evan Wells, while Dave Baggett departed the company for, quote, mostly dispassionate opportunity cost reasons, though he continued working with Josh Mansell on the music for Crash 3, and later Crash Team Racing. If their strict 9-month production cycle wasn't bad enough, their relationship with Universal had suddenly taken a turn for the worse. By this point, Universal's role had basically shrunk to nothing. Sony was financing and publishing the games, while additionally providing valuable worldwide production advice. Cerny had left Universal to become an independent contractor under his own company, Cerny Games, where he continued to work with Naughty Dog, and of course, Naughty Dog was doing the heavy lifting of developing the titles. Universal was simply being paid for the intellectual property rights. Gavin and Rubin weren't willing to split the developer's share of revenue with an entity which wasn't contributing anything to the mix, that was extremely difficult to work with, and that was actively trying to take credit for Crash's success. So they made the decision to not renew their contract with Universal and would leave the backlot after Crash 3. In response, Universal Interactive decided to make the team's lives as miserable as possible, jeopardizing the development and therefore success of Crash 3 in the process. Although they were still contractually obligated to provide Naughty Dog with office space, they decided to force them into the hallways of said offices. They also refused to pay for the air conditioning after hours. This meant that during the night, the Los Angeles summer heat would cause the 34th floor to pass 100 degrees Fahrenheit, or 37 degrees Celsius. They had to buy thermometers and measure the temperature constantly, because the heat was making their servers go down due to the hard drives exceeding their maximum designed operating temperatures. Universal also wouldn't allow them to bring in their own portable air conditioning units, so they were forced to cool their servers by blowing air over a bucket of ice with an electric fan. Eventually, they managed to disguise an air conditioning unit as a mini refrigerator and snaked the exhaust vent into the false ceiling. All of the heat ended up in this one woman's office and melted everything meltable, like chocolates and candles. When she came into work on Monday, she had no clue what had happened. According to Rob Titus, Crash 3 was originally pitched as a puzzle game. Naughty Dog was contracted to make 3 games with Universal, but their contract didn't specify what the third game had to be. So when they were finishing up Crash 2, a bogus puzzle game was made to propose to Universal. Rubin then used this as leverage for more money on Crash 3. With Crash 2, the team believed they had made the ultimate Crash game, and so they asked themselves what they could do for another sequel, and within their short time frame. While they certainly could have just made more levels of the same type, they decided not to do that, and instead traded Sleep for a better title. So Gavin, Omi and White, the 3 programmers, began working on new gameplay engines. These sub-engines, Jet Ski, Motorcycle and Biplane, wouldn't play like traditional Crash levels that players were used to, and would end up making up about a third of the game. To further differentiate Crash 3, they modified their main engine to support long-distance views and level of detail, or LOD features, which made the game's levels feel more expansive and less claustrophobic. In the first 2 games, the maximum distance in which you could see any polygon was about 70 meters, but in Crash 3, this was opened up to some 700 meters, 10 times as far. For example, in the game's first level, Toad Village, a medieval castle at the end of the level can be seen from the very beginning in the background. They used multiple LOD stages and worked hard to create an LOD swapping methodology that was invisible to the player. In the jet ski levels, for instance, the pirate ships are 1600 polygons when you're up close, but can go down to just 200 polygons when you're far away. The background polygon resource manager needed serious reworking in order to handle this kind of increased polygon load, as did the AI memory manager. Since most of Crash 2's animations were still appropriate, they concentrated on adding new ones, with several times the animation of the second game, with Crash himself having around 30,000 frames of animation total. Their Sony Computer Entertainment America producers also asked them to add real shadows, because they were tired of seeing the little discus shape that followed Crash around. At first, Naughty Dog refused, because adding one would have been a pain, but then they later decided to just do it, and so every character, including Crash, got a real soft-edged translucent shadow that mirrored the animated shape of the character. It turned out that the real shadow helped with the platforming, because when they had the little discus shape, they didn't really notice it, but you took notice of a shadow that actually represented the shape of the character, and it made sense, making it much easier to nail the long jumps. In Crash 2, the team had created a pseudo-software Z buffer that worked on a flat plane, but for Crash 3, they wanted to top that by making an unrestrained Z buffer. Since the PS1 didn't have hardware support for a Z buffer, like the N64, the best it could do was draw a full polygon. It never checked to see whether or not it should draw individual pixels, and because of this, the scenes in all PS1 games were drawn from the back forward. Once the decision to draw a polygon was made, the polygon would wipe out anything it was drawn on top of, regardless of whether or not it was close to the camera or not. So if Crash was drawn on the PS1 with water subdividing him, the best the unassisted PlayStation could do was decide which polygons were mostly below the surface and which polygons were mostly above the surface. The resulting split was a jagged edge, not a smooth subdivision. In order to make the jet ski levels and the flooded Egyptian level Tomb Raider work, they needed to implement a true Z buffer. The waves needed to subdivide Coco in any direction, and the background elements like the ramps, islands and buoys had to work too. Not only that, but all of the crates and multiple enemies had to work at the same time, meaning it couldn't just be a near effect, but an actual fully operational Z buffer that could function as well as a hardware Z buffer and still allow the game to hit its 30 FPS target. To keep it performant, they made the bombs and buoys flat 2D billboards, like how the trees appear in Super Mario 64. In order to preserve the round effect of the bombs, they didn't allow the water to split as a flat plane. Instead, they created a curved cut around the flat plane. They created a very fluid and realistic ocean pattern, and made the surface of the water an environment map to reflect the sky and further sell the illusion. This is most evident in the level Ski Crazed, where a volcano and a red sky makes the water appear as a kind of oil slick, with the red reflections on it. These new free-roaming style levels presented a great gameplay challenge. The jet ski levels in particular represented a new kind of level that was not present in the first two games. They were part racing game, part vehicle game, and part regular Crash level. By combining familiar elements, like the crates and creatures, with new mechanics, they could add to the gameplay variety without sacrificing the consistency of the game, but according to Tidus, the jet ski levels came about kind of by happenstance. They never sat down and said they were going to make a jet ski level, rather it came together through bits and pieces. Omi had asked Tidus to create a 100 by 100 quad poly mesh, which he did, and then promptly forgot about. Then Omi came back to Pongilinan and told him to create geometry that snapped to 1 meter grid points at the base. He then had Iwazaki create the cannonballs and the boundary markers. Eventually these pieces came together to form the basis for the jet ski levels, but it was weird, because they were just a collection of afterthoughts. Creating a new mechanic for Crash 3 involved trying to make it play and work well with Rubin's animation for the character, because it all had to integrate together, such as with the motorcycle levels. When Crash turns, he brings the motorcycle down and sticks his leg out, like the way a real motorcycle rider does. So there's a real interaction between the gameplay programming, controlling the feel of the motorcycle, and the animation. If it felt clunky, then it just wasn't going to be much fun. To give the Desert Highway some character, they opted for a 1950s America flavour, with full-service gas stations and diners dotting the roadside. However, they weren't trying to create realistic simulators. Instead, they wanted to create more of an arcade experience. For the biplane levels, for example, they didn't want a plane to come up from behind to shoot the player without them seeing it coming, as that felt cheap. Instead, they made sure the planes came out in front of Crash, and that the player would have ample time to shoot them before they turned around to shoot at the player. A number of superpowers were also added that unlocked after defeating the game's bosses, such as the double jump, Death Tornado Spin, and Fruit Bazooka, with players being able to chain certain moves together to greatly add to the depth of gameplay, like combining a slide, double jump, and Death Tornado Spin, for example. Even with such a tight schedule, they wanted to find ways to add more longevity, so they improved the quality of the boss fights and tuning of the game, along with a brand new time trial mode and a new collectible to go along with it, the Time Relics. Crash 2 had 2 modes of play for each level: standard completion, represented by crystals, and box completion, represented by gems. The new time trial mode allowed players to compete against themselves, each other, and preset goals in timed level completion. This added replay value to every level in the game, requiring players to spend twice as long completing Crash 3 than they needed to for Crash 2. The game's time travel theme was chosen because Daniel Array, Gavin, Ruben, and a number of others on the team were all big fans of time travel. It also allowed them to open up the game, differentiate the graphical look, and increase the amount of variety of gameplay. It really felt like an expansion of the universe, because they could put Crash in all these unique situations, with unique visuals, and it was just more fun. The time travel theme also allowed Naughty Dog's artists to stretch beyond the limits imposed by the island theme setting of the previous games. Each time period had distinctly unique structures and colour palettes, as evidenced by the Arabian-themed levels, Hang 'em High, and Flaming Passion, the latter taking place during the night, while the former takes place during the day. When revisiting a time period on a later level, the team realised that colour could greatly add variety, even when the structures remained mostly the same. The Atlantis-themed levels Under Pressure and Deep Trouble were among the most difficult looks to achieve, as nobody could agree how Atlantis should be portrayed. Ideas varied from an ancient Roman-esque city in ruins to a high-tech submerged city of alien origin. But despite these initial uncertainties, everyone agreed that the resulting underwater environments were among the most visually striking of the Crash series. The Great Wall of China levels, Orient Express, and Midnight Run seemed like the perfect fit for Crash's famous animal riding antics. However, this time they chose to give the spotlight to Coco and her tiger pal, Purah. Unlike Crash, Coco only appeared in non-platforming levels, as they wanted to give Coco her own flavour in the game. The reason they made Coco a playable character was because a lot of female players were introduced to Crash through her, becoming some of the most highly played titles by guild gamers at that time, and Naughty Dog wanted them to be able to play as a character they could more easily identify with. Portraying the wall as under construction allowed for some visual variety, while providing obvious gameplay obstacles. Purah was originally considered as a panda bear, but was deemed too similar to Crash 2's polar bear. When designing the character, Zimbillis was provided a sketch from one of Naughty Dog's artists, and was directed to use it as a model. While he didn't enjoy working this way, as he felt it stifled his creativity, he didn't make a big fuss about it, and went along with what they wanted, while trying to do his best with the concept. Overall, he felt that Purah was a nice character, but also felt that the design could have been enhanced. Since the plot of the game involved time travel, Crash 3 called for a time-travelling villain. The result was Entropy, the nefarious and smug inventor of the Time Twister machine. Entropy went through much iteration before the final design was reached. Zimbillis' first idea was to give him a belt-like time-travelling contraption with a readout as to the year he intended to jump to. He continued with the idea of a time-travelling device that would be worn on the body, with the design eventually evolving into something that would encase the character, but early sketches made Entropy look pregnant. As he continued to refine the look, he ended up with something that became the first design pass on the character. 2 more sessions would follow a little later to further flesh him out. As the design of Entropy continued to emerge, his body gear started to become more industrialized. In Zimbillis' second session, he further refined the time-travelling contraption by adding a lot of detail that resembled the gears and mechanisms of clocks, including a cuckoo clock at the lower right side of his machine. The next phase of his development was to make some dimensional sense of what was taking shape. The paraphernalia on his body gear was too over the top for the original PlayStation console. The pistons on his back were also overly complex, with elements that operated as flexible joints at the top. Taking all of this into consideration, Zimbillis managed to nail the final look and feel of the character. The body machinery was simplified, with the elimination of most of the gear work, and the 4 small pistons on his back were replaced with 2 larger ones. The exhaust pipes were reduced to 1, and the timepiece was altered so that it took up most of the device. Crash 3 also introduced Uka Uka to the series, a voodoo masked spirit and evil twin brother to Aku Aku. Unlike Entropy, the design of Uka Uka came together rather quickly. After his 3rd sketch, the final look for the character started to emerge, and subsequent sketches were basically just refinements. Since Aku Aku already existed, there was something for Zimbillis to follow, which is why the design was much easier. Crash Bandicoot Warped launched on the 3rd of November 1998 in North America to critical and commercial acclaim, with pretty much all reviewers in unanimous agreement that the game was superior to its predecessors in every conceivable way. The game's graphics were lauded by critics, with Game Revolution calling it, quote, the pinnacle of PlayStation rendering, and Crash has incredible texture quality, lack of noticeable dithering, and some of the best backgrounds ever seen in a game. Other reviewers offered similar praise for the game's visuals, with the waves and the jet ski levels in particular being a highlight for some, offering the best and most realistic looking waves seen in a PlayStation title to date. The smooth character animation, bright colourful landscapes, and beautiful lighting effects, all presented at a stable 30 FPS, were other aspects that critics took notice of. The game was also a commercial success, shipping more than 2.9 million copies worldwide by February 1999, with sales of the Crash Bandicoot series as a whole surpassing 11.5 million copies worldwide. In June 1999, Crash 3 received the Platinum Prize in Japan for sales of over 1 million units, becoming the first non-Japanese PlayStation title to ever do so. In mid-1998, while Crash 3 was still in production, Naughty Dog started work on their next game, codenamed Project X, but Crash was nowhere to be seen. Instead, the game featured blockheaded characters with no personality to speak of. Prior to this, the team had discussed in meetings what their next game should be, and decided that they didn't want to make a fourth platform game, as they felt they'd already exhausted all of their good ideas. The development cycle for Crash 3 had also seriously drained the team, so the idea of making another one wasn't very appealing. They were itching to do something new, and it just so happened that their technology was reaching a point where they felt confident doing something in 3D that didn't require a camera to be locked in place with a pre-calculated number of polygons. The team were also big fans of kart races like Mario Kart, and were extremely into multiplayer games, so the idea of bringing something similar over to the PlayStation seemed like a no-brainer. Over the course of developing 3 Crash games, the team had accumulated a diverse range of 3D art assets, characters, and locations that they could base their tracks on, so it only made sense to make Project X a part of the Crash universe. There was just one problem: they didn't own the rights, as the Crash IP was the property of Universal Interactive Studios. At this point in time, CTR was nothing more than a prototype. The team prioritised getting their new engine up and running, while the bulk of Naughty Dog staff wrapped up development of Crash 3. Even during this early prototyping phase, CTR proved to be fun. They built an entire replica of Crescent Island from Diddy Kong Racing to see if they could reproduce a track of that scope and scale on the PlayStation. They were able to demonstrate that they could actually build an environment like this and fit it into memory, whilst maintaining a playable frame rate. The team took what they had to Sony and offered to make the game based on Crash characters, so long as they negotiated with Universal for the rights on their behalf. In the worst case scenario, Sony wouldn't be able to get the rights, and they'd have to come up with original characters. Fortunately, for all parties involved, Sony was able to obtain the rights, and CTR became a reality. Following up 3 critically and commercially successful platformers with a racing game was a bold move for Naughty Dog, and there was some initial concern from a few members of the team, but the vast majority were overwhelmingly enthusiastic about working on the game. Not only was it a nice change of pace, it also gave them the opportunity to further develop technologies that the studio had tinkered with in the vehicle sections of Crash 3. In late 1998, following the release of Crash Bandicoot Warped, the team took a well-earned rest in order to recover. Well, almost all of them. While it had become tradition to take a month off after shipping their holiday release, so that they could come back fresh in the new year to start work on their next project, CTR was being built in a brand new engine, so some of the team needed to stay behind in order to get it finished. Come January 1999, after most of the team had returned from their vacation, CTR shifted into full-scale production. Developing CTR alongside Crash 3 turned out to be the right call, as a small technical design team that had built the game's engine were able to get a lot of things done before the bulk of the art staff were brought on board, which helped to streamline the game's production. This was a blessing in disguise, as Naughty Dog had just hired a new group of programmers and designers who ended up working on the game, including Gavin James, Scott Patterson, Bruce Straley, Greg Tavares, Didier Malenfant, and Paul Christian Ingstad, while the core team behind Crash 3 moved on to Jak and Daxter for the PS2. A new group of people making a game together isn't exactly ideal, and the short 8-month and 6-day production cycle didn't help matters, but by getting the engine done ahead of time, they were able to avoid potential bottlenecks. To help prepare for doing the game, the team took cues from other games in the kart racing genre, most notably Mario Kart. They brought in gamers and watched them play Super Mario Kart and Mario Kart 64 to get some insight. What they learned was that there wasn't much button action. People just held down accelerate and pushed left and right to turn. To address this in CTR, they built the game's vehicles to be far more maneuverable. They knew that the karts needed to be responsive, because if it didn't feel like you were in control, you blamed the game and not yourself. It was such an important thing to get right that they spent numerous hours tuning and refining it throughout development. By giving the player very tight control over their vehicle, they could make the mechanics of CTR more demanding, without being more frustrating. While the game's overall feel took inspiration from Super Mario Kart, for Evan Wells, it was Mario Kart 64 that really got its creative juices flowing. When the game released in North America in early 1997, he was still working at Crystal Dynamics on Gex 2. He really wanted to make a racing game that took on Mario Kart 64, and luckily for him, Naughty Dog was already one step ahead. He was recruited with his good friend Daniel Chan to come work for Naughty Dog, and was delighted to be working on CTR. During the early days of the game's development, the team would play countless hours of Mario Kart 64, analysing the track designs, the feel of the controls, how the AI worked, everything. The PS1 had very different rendering capabilities compared to the N64, so they had to come up with all sorts of tricks to build tracks of a similar scale, while maintaining the high-quality graphics that the Crash Bandicoot series was known for. They also worked on making the AI in CTR more sophisticated than the track-following karts in Mario Kart and Diddy Kong Racing. They wanted the kart to not only move realistically, but to also fire on the player and each other, in order to replicate the feeling that you were playing against real people. To ensure CTR would be fun for players of all skill levels, they implemented a form of dynamic difficulty adjustment to automatically scale the game's challenge depending on who was playing. If the player was lagging behind, for instance, the racers in front would start shooting at each other to cause more of them to crash and give the player a chance to catch up. They wanted the difference between winning and losing to come down to just a few seconds, so that players would never feel too secure about their lead. This rubber banding, despite being a somewhat controversial thing in the games industry, ensured that players of all skill levels could have fun. Playtesting also played a crucial role. Not only did the team playtest it themselves, sometimes going on for hours because they were having so much fun with it, they also did testing on site at Sony. They would videotape players, have them fill out questionnaires, and also watch them behind glass, all for the sake of making CTR a better product. Naughty Dog's biggest headache when developing CTR was trying to overcome the technical limitations of the PlayStation. They were at their peak of their understanding of the console, and yet, even with all of that expertise, they barely managed to get CTR running on it, with the open 3D environments in particular being incredibly taxing on the machine. Part of the challenge of building CTR was trying to figure out how they were going to make the game fit within the constraints of the PS1's hardware, a challenge they almost couldn't overcome. Their previous Crash titles had fixed cameras that travelled down a set path, and because of this, they were able to use their SGI workstations to reduce the number of draw calls of polygons that weren't needed. This not only meant that they had a perfect amount of polygons for any given frame, but it also allowed for textures to be streamed in as the level progressed. CTR's camera, on the other hand, was free to follow a kart wherever it went, so they couldn't stream data as effectively, and most things for a given track had to be in memory at all times. This made CTR an enormous resource hog, so the team needed to implement a variety of complicated real-time engine hacks to get the game running smoothly. They implemented a sophisticated culling routine to prevent the engine from rendering polygons the player couldn't actually see, like the backs of objects. To deal with the challenge of possibly having up to 64 kart tyres on a 4-player split screen, Greg Omi developed an efficient way of rendering them as camera-based sprites, and they rendered the opponent karts to buffers, meaning not every character was drawn each frame, because they had to show 8 karts, and not just a single character. Their engine also solved a number of PlayStation limitations. For example, it was fairly common for PS1 game textures to warp, because the console didn't have any perspective correction. This was especially noticeable whenever big polygons were being used. To solve this problem, Chan and Omi subdivided the polygons that were close to the camera into smaller polygons in order to minimize the effect. Another innovation came with the way they handled textures. They developed a method of creating a single large texture by using lots of smaller ones. For example, the sand on the beaches were made up of 32 by 32 pixel textures for the grains of sand, starfishes, clamshells, etc., that all formed a larger 128 or 256 pixel texture. This had the benefit of both looking great and also being seen as tiny to the PS1's texture memory. One of CTR's most distinguishable features was its turbo system, which was also one of the first mechanics to emerge from the team's early prototyping. Having already noticed the press the accelerate button and steer mechanics of other kart races, Naughty Dog set out to create a way for the player to be more involved. They designed their turbo system to enable players to get boosts of speed, both from hang time and during power slides. the latter being credited to Dan Arey, and was inspired by the power drift mechanics in Japanese racing, while the former added an element of vertical gameplay that hadn't really been seen in the racing genre before. To pull off these boosts, the player needed to manipulate more buttons and be more aware of their driving, which made it feel far more interactive than other kart races on the market. In addition to hang time boosts and power slides, there was also a starting boost that could be activated at the beginning of a race, if timed correctly, turbo pads that were scattered across a track that you could drive over, and turbo power-ups. By using a combination of these different types of turbo, it was possible on some tracks to be at an almost constant boost for an entire lap. When it came time to design the game's power-ups, the team tried to create an even mix of both offensive and defensive weapons, and threw out whatever broke the balance. It was a difficult juggling act, because some players were naturally skilled, so when they added power-ups like the tracking missile, they had to be careful not to tip the scale. They played around with the probability of what came out of the crates, in order to strike the perfect balance. There were also a few power-ups that ended up being cut entirely, such as fake crates, that worked similarly to Mario Kart 64's fake item boxes. These ended up being cut pretty quickly, because they felt cheap. Another power-up that was cut was a spring, that would allow your kart to perform a high jump. Like the feather in Super Mario Kart, it wasn't a fun power-up to use. Anytime a person got it, they just used it immediately, so that they could get a more useful power-up, so it ended up being thrown out. When deciding CTR's races, the team had a wealth of characters to choose from. They went through all of the characters in the Crash universe, and tried to pick an appropriate mix of good and evil. Numerous assets from Crash 1 were recycled for CTR, Papu Papu being one such example. Due to the memory limitations of the PS1, they weren't able to do the lip sync on his entire body, so they chopped off his head and put his body on a generic loop, so that only the head needed to be animated. They were also originally going to have Purah and Polar ride together in the same kart, but due to memory limitations, they couldn't get it to work. Both Komodo Moe and Joe were planned to be playable, but Komodo Moe ended up being left on the sidelines, because the team ran out of time to properly implement him. Penta Penguin was a secret unlockable character, and the only racer with all of his stats maxed out, except in the US version, where he was a light character, similar to Purah and Polar. In the first print of the game, Gavin James can be heard saying,
"Penguin Ye 1, Penguin Ye 2,
in a monotone voice. These were originally recorded as placeholders, but they somehow slipped past the QA team and ended up in the final product. When Rob Titus took a copy of the game home, the day it went gold, he noticed the bug and immediately called Daniel Chan, but it was too late to change it. This bug was fixed for subsequent releases. The game's antagonist, Nitrous Oxide, came about through a collaborative effort. The idea of making him an alien first clicked when the team was building Oxide Station. Ruben had the idea of giving him 4 legs. Their Japanese producers had the idea of a racer helmet-like design, and several of their American producers came up with the idea of dreads coming out of the sides of his head. After CTR launched, rumours persisted about a way of unlocking Nitrous Oxide as a playable character. While the team had considered making him playable at one point, they were under such extreme memory limitations that they just couldn't get him to work across the entire game. They even had to design his boss level specifically with his larger character model in mind. Raffi was responsible for making the level, and spent a lot of time cutting it down to fit it into memory, as the level was originally 3 times longer than it appeared in the final game. By using a GameShark cheat device, it's possible to unlock Nitrous Oxide in the game, but you aren't able to play as him on every track, and even on ones you can, the game will frequently crash. The team was well aware of GameShark cheat devices, as they were kind of a big deal back then, but what's most surprising is that according to Wells, they actually used one themselves in the office, because it allowed them to install a thing called Izo-Ray, which was Yarrows spelled backwards. Net Yarrows was a special development kit that Sony gave out to fans, so that they could make their own homebrew-style PS1 games. Naughty Dog used Izo-Ray in the office, because it would give them better data dumps whenever the game crashed. The game's story originally depicted Nitrous Oxide as a mad scientist obsessed with speed. So much so that he concocts an elaborate scheme to speed up Crash's world by using his Hyper-Activator, a diabolical device that he built to speed up the entire planet. When switched into overdrive, minutes become seconds and days become hours. Being an ultra-fast freak of nature, this would finally allow Nitrous Oxide to be comfortable with the world at this new speed. The rest of the world's citizens, however, would be lost in an endless mind-wrenching blur as everything zooms past them in the blink of an eye. Crash, his friends, and his lifetime enemies must work together in one united attempt to defeat nitrous oxide once and for all. In the shipped game, nitrous oxide challenges Crash's will to a racing contest he calls Survival of the Fastest. Should the inhabitants win, the planet will be spared, but should he win, then the entire planet will be turned into a concrete parking lot. To accompany the story, the team included a Diddy Kong Racing-inspired adventure mode, where players win trophies and boss keys in order to progress. It was a lot of extra work, but they felt compelled to tell some kind of a story, as it seemed a waste not to use these great characters and this rich world that they had created. It also allowed players to have some sense of progression and continued play. CTR's racetracks took inspiration from all of the interesting locations across the different levels in previous Crash games. They knew they were going to do a lot of island-themed stuff, but they also wanted to experiment with some new ideas. They also enhanced each track with set pieces to complement its theme, such as the half-pipe in Sewer Speedway. When building that track, Titus put drivable collision all the way around the pipes to see if you could drive on top of them. To the surprise of both him and Gavin James, who did the game's physics, it actually worked. It did cause the camera to freak out, but once they got it sorted, it felt great, kind of like skateboarding. For the track Cortex Castle, they made all of the turns 90-degree angles so that you'd have to navigate it very quickly and sharply. Tiger Temple, which had the working title Temple Ruins, was the first track Titus created, and he initially hated it. After abandoning it for a few months, he reluctantly came back to finish it, and it ended up turning out great. The twisting in the tunnel worked well, and he was pleased with the lighting. In the end, while he initially hated working on it, it ended up becoming his favourite track in the whole game. As well as theming, CTR's tracks also needed structure and features. They approached each track the same way they might approach a platformer level. There were main pathways to follow, but also secrets to uncover. So when it came time to make a new track, they'd first sit down and lay out stuff on paper. Then they'd bring in artists, who'd add their own ideas, and they'd all work together in small groups for each track. The game's engine also made track creation reasonably straightforward. Once they had built a track, they could knock them out pretty quickly, spending an average of 3 weeks per track. As they neared their deadline, certain features had to be cut in order to keep the game on schedule. Originally, they had the idea of players earning gold wrenches to upgrade their kart's performance, such as its acceleration, handling, and top speed. By completing races and defeating bosses in the game's adventure mode, you'd be awarded with these wrenches, which you could then use to buy different engine, exhaust, and tyre upgrades for your kart. You could then save your upgraded kart to your memory card and use it in multiplayer matches. However, they soon realised that doing so would break the game's balance. After all, it'd be no fun to go up against someone who had a top-end car if you didn't. Worse still, if the player chose the wrong upgrades in adventure mode, it might have made it impossible to win new races. While they could have eventually solved these problems, the team simply didn't have the time to test all of the possible combinations to make sure it was both balanced and winnable, so they ended up scrapping the idea entirely. An ice-themed track created by Titus was also cut. It was a short 8-figure track that was all ice. He reused assets from the other snowy-themed tracks to create it, and he was pretty much finished with it when he showed it to Ruben and Wells. Sadly, they didn't have enough time to properly debug it, so while it was a fun track to play, it ended up being dropped. Crash Team Racing was released on the 19th of October 1999 in North America to generally positive reviews, with critics lauding it as a great Mario Kart clone that managed to succeed where similar games had failed. But for all of the fun the game was, making it was extremely taxing on the team. For Ruben, it was the hardest game he'd ever directed, thanks in part to the short amount of time they had to develop it. While everything turned out great in the end, delivering a polished game on such a tight schedule with an entirely new engine was very stressful. So stressful, in fact, that several team members were burnt out by the end of its aggressive development cycle. Ruben later admitted that they kept adding game modes late into CTR's development, which didn't help matters. While additional modes like the Battle Arena were a welcome addition, they took their toll on those that worked on them. As a consequence of this, CTR had more bugs to fix than their previous titles. The game was plagued with a myriad of issues and would frequently crash, churning out nonsense results in data. It was sloppy compared to Naughty Dog standards, but nobody complained. They were also trying to ship the game to 3 territories and had decided to include Dutch to the game's languages, which complicated things further. If that wasn't bad enough, the studio's culture was changing quite a bit during this time as well. They went from working with Universal to becoming an independent team, and then eventually becoming a first-party PlayStation studio. While this transition took several years, it started around the time when CTR was being developed. CTR was a commercial success, going on to sell 1.9 million copies in North America and receiving the ELSPA Platinum Sales Award for more than 300,000 sales in the United Kingdom. In Japan, CTR sold over 360,000 copies by February 2000. In December 1999, Naughty Dog officially said goodbye to Crash, deciding instead to create a new IP with Sony for the PS2, which became Jak and Daxter. Universal's publishing deal with Sony ended a year later, in 2000, following the release of the party game Crash Bash, developed by Eurocom Entertainment Software. Universal Interactive continued publishing Crash titles for several more years, bringing the series to other consoles and handhelds, but almost all of them received mixed to negative reviews from critics. The company was renamed and consolidated numerous times, until eventually merging with Activision Blizzard in 2008. Soon after, in 2010, following the release of Crash Bandicoot Nitro Kart 2 for the iPhone and iPod Touch, the Crash series entered a 6-year dormant period. Then, at E3 2016, during Sony's press conference, Shawn Layden announced a timed partnership with Activision to remake the original Naughty Dog trilogy, and that Crash would be coming to Skylanders Imaginators as a playable character. The remake was developed by Vicarious Visions under the title Crash Bandicoot N. Sane Trilogy, and released for the PlayStation 4 on the 30th of June 2017, with ports for the Xbox One, Nintendo Switch, and PC arriving a year later. This was then followed up with a remake of CTR in 2019, called Crash Team Racing Nitro Fueled, developed by Beenox, and a brand new platformer in 2020 titled Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time, developed by Toys for Bob. All three games were received positively by critics and fans alike, kickstarting a sort of renaissance for the Crash series. However, this was then followed by Crash Bandicoot On the Run and Crash Team Rumble, a 2021 endless runner for mobile devices, and a 2023 online multiplayer game for consoles, respectively, that were both received quite poorly. According to Rubin, had Naughty Dog regained the rights to Crash, or been able to share them with Sony, they would have likely continued making Crash games. They had plans for a free-roaming Crash title that returned to Crash 1's roots, and stripped the game back to its simplest form. Had it been made, it likely wouldn't have been as ambitious as Jak and Daxter, but Rubin believed that they might have ended up with a more playable game. If you enjoyed this video, and would like to support the work I do, then please consider checking out my Patreon, or becoming a channel member, where you can get exclusive access to new documentaries before anyone else, see monthly updates on the progress of whatever documentary I'm currently working on, and even have your name featured at the end of each documentary you funded. You can also send a one-time tip via Ko-fi, or a super thanks, if that's more your style. Click the card or the links in the description below.